Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. I'm so thrilled today to be joined by the fantastic director, Josh Ruben, to talk about all about his film, IFC's Werewolves Within. And when you first went in and started pitching as a director with Ubisoft, I was really interested in what it was that you originally had as your vision and how even just the pitch process of coming onto this project from Mishna's script really helped you in terms of how you started to see this film directorially.
Well, the wonderful thing is, that's a great question. The wonderful thing is that from the get-go, Mishna's script was very reminiscent of Fargo and Hot Fuzz and Arachnophobia. Those are the first kind of images of inspiration that came to mind. And my pitch was really, what you want to do is come at it from a personal sort of perspective. I grew up in a small town like Beaverfield. I knew people like this. These are also the characters I love to, play in a playground I love to play in, but also a style I was excited about. So I think that kind of energy was inherent from the get-go. And then when I started to do my sort of director's polish on the script and working with the producers on the script as well, most of what I was doing was pretty much just leaning into the comedy and making it as kind of trim as I possibly could, as the team possibly could. And then also selfishly reformatting it in such a way that felt like the most digestible version of the script for my crew and myself.
And I know that early on, someone made the suggestion to you that perhaps you could play Finn, and your immediate response was that you didn't want to do that. And so, why was it so important to you to hand that character over and to have someone else play him?
Well, this is the biggest job I've helmed as a solo director. It's a massive responsibility. I was able to do it with three other actors on Scare Me on my first feature. And I've self-directed with College Humor and the like before. But also, I think I've scratched the itch for playing, certainly for leading a film. There's only so much I can do and so much I can do that's like interesting. I terraformed a part for me, but it's time to see Sam Richardson play the hero.
And when you cast Sam, he himself has said that he usually gets cast as a supporting character, as one of the friends, and this is him taking the lead, and he's so fantastic in it. And so I was interested in the way that the two of you worked together collaboratively to really center his character as the core of the film, so that then you could build the other characters in the periphery around him.
Sam is, when you meet him, he is Finn. I mean, he's a comedic superhero. So he's going to be operating at 100% comedic capacity no matter what. But it was fun to be able to just sort of to talk to him, and I think in certain instances direct him to be like, this is how the Sam I know would react to X situation. You are an inherently good human being. It's also something that I think he and I both, that we didn't talk too in depth about it. He and I are both quite passionate about like being like good people with like, decent manners, and then also have a bit of, I would say, an anger, frustration, and resentment for those who don't go out of their way or who don't meet your kindness with kindness. And for different reasons for both of us. We're very different people from very different backgrounds. But that was exciting to sort of guide him in that direction, just with that sort of kinship of like, I know you're like a good human being. I know you're probably angry about when people are, crap.
And his character has a little bit of a youthful naivety to him in certain ways, like instances where he doesn't realize that his girlfriend's broken up with him, even though she suggested they spend time apart and he moves somewhere completely different for a long period of time. But how did you want to balance the naivety of his character along with making sure that he did have skills and he did have a lot of strong attributes as well, so that it was never pushing too far into the comedy of the naivety where we don't believe that this character would be able to figure out a lot of elements that he does in the film?
It was pretty cool. I think Sam did so much work, on the character. Like when he showed up, there was really not much for me to say. Not a whole lot of direction I had to give Sam, for Finn, because I think he was excited to play a kind of more vulnerable, sort of focused, authoritative character. I think what we did talk about was the pushover element, him kind of fighting and suppressing his feelings up until, he can't possibly anymore, where he has to meet the town on his level. So honestly, it was, with most of the cast and in this situation, it's a lot of like, give me a bit more of that ridiculous humor or pull back on it so we don't get caught trying to be funny too much. but for him, I mean, he was kind of impeccable. It was just like mild shaping, you know. I think it was, and it has everything to do with his commitment to playing Finn.
It also feels like his character has a little bit of frustration in feeling like he doesn't quite fit the archetypal, you know, perception of masculinity. And so, how did you want to explore that conversation through him as a character?
It was pretty cool because actually, there are instances where Cecily tells Finn to man up and grow a pair, and Milana and Sam and I had some pretty in-depth conversations about what that means, especially in the context of this woman, this white woman, telling this black man to man up, and what that masculinity sort of, what that means and the responsibility of that and everything else. It was really about them being like comfortable with the context of all of it. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, it ultimately just the beacon is goodness, and the dialogue is the dialogue, and I think it's just a matter of like Sam's character, like Finn, keeping his eye on the ball of what he was going after. And I don't know. It was kind of a wonderful thing because it is this masculinity, and the sort of myth of it all is such a relevant and also sort of unfortunately deadly, as my friend Liz Plank has written about, thing. It was wonderful to explore it, through a character, like Finn, and with Sam at the helm, because he understood and didn't lean too far in any direction. We felt that it was quite handled well, and we all cared about the messaging.
And when you introduce him as a character on screen, you really successfully give us such a glimpse of every single aspect of his personality, even just in that moment where he's driving and he's by himself, there's no other characters, and he's on the phone trying to call someone. And that also follows another scene that kind of sets up the tension and the horror element. And so within those first 3 minutes of the film, you know exactly the world that you're in. And so I was very interested in how, as a director, you wanted to set up this myriad of tones in those first few minutes, and the challenge of really encompassing it all right at the beginning so the audiences know the space that they're coming into.
Oh man, that's a great question. I mean, again, so much of it was sort of in Mishna's script, but then we did play with, opening the film with a quote to really show, especially once we sort of found that kind of angle in the edit. There was always a conversation about Mr. Rogers and, the sort of Emerson Flint conversation. So I think later in the process, in the edit, we thought, let's really lean into the style here. We're seeing this kind of paced up Shaun of the Dead type world. Let's really lean in and show them what we're talking about up top and see how it feels. And also, I mean, there's only so much that I can kind of be the barometer for tonally. But I have to say, Brett Bachman, as our editor, really provided so much sort of style to the whole thing, and opened my eyes, and blew my mind throughout the process. He's such a stylistic and visceral editor. Just his kind of innovative ideas and thinking and challenging sort of questions about the narrative and everything really helped kind of, just lean in further to the style of it all. But it's just a world that I've grown up loving, from American Werewolf in London to Monster Squad to even the, Freddy Krueger films. That balance of horror and violence is something, unfortunately, spiritually in my blood. Like, I understand it maybe too well. I've seen it, so much mixed tone, extreme tone, mishmashed movies since I was a kid. I think I just inherently sort of get it, but this was all about just, finding the voice that was best to suit the film.
And with the fact you're talking about the editing there, it feels like that was such a vital part of the process as a filmmaker for a project like this, because so much of how this film works and so many of the scenes land is a lot to do with the pacing and the timing. And you've got the tension building, which has one set of timing, and then you've got all of the comedic beats, which is a totally different type of pacing together. And so what was that collaboration in terms of finding a lot of the pacing and the beats in post-production with him?
Oh man, I mean, it was the whole process, putting the scenes together and sort of finding, whether or not you need the sort of Agatha Christie montage to sum it up in the end, like Knives Out or not, is one thing, but it becomes about trimming and comedic timing, and trying to step outside of yourself, especially as a comedian or a comedic minded human being, to see objectively, is this going to land? So much of it was playing with the timing of it all. When I was a kid, my dad kicked my ass. Like, how much time do we give that to breathe before everyone goes, okay? How much time do you give before the explosion pops off after the gunshot towards the end? it's a matter of frames, and that science is really fun for me. The jump scares are another thing, or the dread is another thing, and figuring out, finagling that timing is another thing. And sometimes, frankly, it can be challenging with 8 people who are very passionate. I'm talking about, my team, from my producers, myself, my editor. Everybody has kind of a different, it touches on a different sort of part of the palette for everybody. So being able to step away and then, and to test it, to do our test audience during the pandemic on Zoom, is really fascinating, and talk back like, hey, what was the scariest part? What didn't work? What did this, that, and the other thing was very, very helpful. But Brett was ultimately integral. And I have to say too, I mean, this should go without saying, although in Hollywood, people typically steamroll writers. That wasn't any piece of what I wanted to do with this process. Mishna was involved from the get-go. And at the home stretch, we had sort of 2 versions of the film, and we showed her one that was a bit less expositional and a bit more. And she was like, oh, this one is, the less expositional, smarter, tighter, was the one to go. And we call it the Mishna cut. And that's the one everyone, oh, we gotta do, so I was very, very grateful. She kind of came into extra point at the one we were all kind of leaning towards.
There's also a lot of really phenomenal sound design in there. And, sometimes it's larger moments and sometimes it's something really small, like the sound of an axe hitting a target and the noise that you then enhance with that. And so how did you really want to use sound design to enhance a lot of what you were creating on screen in post-production as well?
It's everything. It's everything for dread. It's everything for comedy too. A floorboard, a door creak can be the difference between killing a joke or making a joke, or killing a scare or making a scare. I'm immensely involved in the sound design process. Owen Granitz Young and Matt Davies are on our sound team. This was the first time I've worked with a real Foley department, where Matt Davies would, be creating snow slosh sounds, and, the sounds of doors breaking off hinges and the like, and werewolf growls, etc. The biggest, the most important thing for me, same thing with Scare Me, with my first film, you don't want to take anybody out of it. You just want to enhance the experience, right? You don't want any audience member to go, oh, I'm thinking about the door creak. It's too much. Or the wind, it's too much, the rattle, whatever. So you want to strike that balance between, an organic sound, a genuine sound, a real in-world sound, and something that it is enhancing for the audience.
And before you even cast the film, it just sounds like you had such a kinetic energy connection to the comedic aspect of it. And so were you starting to think about a lot of ways that you could take Mishna's script and really, elevate the comedy off of the page with your cast even before you started the casting process?
Oh, absolutely. Part of my pitch process was actually taking swaths of the script. So I would copy paste in the Courier font, and I'd drop it in Keynote, my rewrite. So I would say, well, before, where we have this sort of beat that, goes from, this line, which could be a punchline, right into this next swath of dialogue, let's really create the punchline there by, a hard cut. So I would write in or rewrite or show my revisions on the screen when I'm actually presenting my pitch deck to Ubisoft. When I was in their offices, vying for the gig, and my 45-minute speech. So a lot of it was, a big piece of my pitch was, literally, here is how I would do it. Here's just an example of my writing sensibility and what I would do. And also, we will be trimming here, so that's useful. So yeah, and I think that's integral for any filmmaker pitching on anything. Is show examples of how you would go in and rewrite it. Give people like every sort of piece of example of it. And I've learned that skill, I think, from many years of directing commercials and great executive producers at commercial houses, really, raking me over the coals to putting me to task to like pare open every detail of a script and of a spot to say, well, how would you change it? How would you elevate it? This, that, and the other thing. So I was ready and willing and stoked to show every sort of, modicum of how I'd take it on.
And one of the benefits of having Finn come into this setting as a completely new character to this space is that it gives you the opportunity for that initial exposition with the other characters, because he's literally being introduced to them all by Cecily. And so you get that this is who they are, this is what they do, this is their husband, and you see their personality type right up front. Was that something that from the script you found very beneficial in being able to set up a lot of the characters in a very short space of time for such an ensemble?
Yeah, there was an early version of it that I couldn't wrap my head around. I thought, oh, there's no way I could make this interesting. It might have been more when like Finn was kind of driving through town and we were seeing like, the houses that read the sign that said, the X family lived here. And I thought, how am I going to do this without truly copying Edgar Wright? But ultimately, um, we found a method that worked really well, and it was paced up, again with the help of Brett, and of course our producer sensibilities and everything, that didn't feel sort of overly expositional or trodden, that hopefully feels fun and set to good music and the like, and buoyed by the performances.
Yeah. One of the characters that seems like it may have been challenging from the outside in order to set him up and make him very believable is Emerson, because he's the more extreme of
Mm.
the characters. He lives in a very isolated space. He's the person that will shoot you if you're on your property. And then you have all of the production design with all of the animals that he's killed, and he's wearing all these furs, which works so good. But if you tipped a little further over that line, it might have read as not a believable character. So, were there any challenges in figuring out a lot of the aspects of that character?
That was a really cool collaboration between David Tabbert, our costume designer, wardrobe designer, who's brilliant, and Brett Tanzer, our production designer, and the casting of Glenn Fleshler. So here you have, production designers and wardrobe geniuses who are going to lean in and really make it look like what would really happen if you sort of lost it a bit, or if you really went off the grid but did so successfully, but not so much that it'd be a cartoon character, but still almost, Rooster Cogburn kind of close to it. But Glenn grounds it. I mean, Glenn is a imposing presence, and he brings the kind of gravity to it. So much of it, is the casting as well. The fact that he was willing to do the beard and the wig and everything else, and excited the teeth, that helped eons. You want to ground it as much as you can. I mean, you look around the production design and the details of his wardrobe and his performance, and everything has kind of a grit and grime and grease to it. You believe that he's been there for a bit, and that's I think the key to not taking anything too far is, what would it really be like if, but how far can we go? That's like, my, I feel like my mission statement. Sometimes I don't get away with anything, but
The costume design overall is really, really specific in terms of character detail. You have
Mhm.
Michaela's character, who's in a lot of very pristine, kind of like light pinks. You've got Cheyenne, who's wearing, a very stylish winter jacket and hat.
Mhm.
It's kind of style over function a little bit almost. And so you
Mhm.
use those details to tell us a lot about all of these characters, particularly when we first meet them. And so, how were
Mhm.
you thinking about the cast overall, and how you really wanted to make them also individual and unique to tell us those aspects?
Oh, that was everything. I mean, that's again working very closely with David Tabbert, and, sort of putting him to task, and also with our cinematographer, with Matt Wise, to say, we have all of these brown walls. What are the colors that are going to pop off of that palette? A, and B, how can we make sure that all our actors, of course, have skin in the game to contribute what they feel like their characters might be wearing, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a combination of, again, that cast collaboration, but our cinematographer and David working together, to make sure that the palettes were complementary, that they were easy on the eyes, easy to look at, they popped off the walls, and and yeah, how that all ultimately came together was, quite wonderful. I think the thing that we were all most worried about, or at least Matt was, my cinematographer, was Cheyenne Jackson's jacket, was Devin's jacket, because it was bright white. But, and I said, I promise you, this is going to work even when we're out in the snow and it's at night. It is going to have a pop that won't be detrimental to the image. And ultimately, we were right. It was really David Tabbert's, brilliant call.
Yeah. And you were mentioning the production design before, and I know that it was
Mhm.
important to you, working with Ubisoft to make a film that was representative of the game, but wasn't a direct copy and wasn't
Mhm.
necessarily pulling in every specific detail. But production design, it sounds like, is one of the spaces where you snuck a lot of details, like the ledger at the hotel. And so I was interested
Mhm.
in a lot of the spaces where you snuck in those details for that connection to the game.
The ledger was a big one. I basically took a lot of set pieces from the game, screenshots from the game that the creators so generously provided, and gave it to Brett Tanzer. I gave it to the production design team, Laura Crawford, our set dresser, and said, take color palette, take artwork, and let's see where we can kind of put it in here. Some stuff in the game is a bit, it's a medieval town. Some of the artwork can be a bit cartoonish and the like. I think there's an homage to it. The painting in the hallway upstairs when Sarah Burns' character is sort of approaching it. That artwork is sort of congruent to the game. And they inlaid very small specific details in the library. So ultimately it's more in the kind of color palette and rather than like the specific sort of pieces. Although I did one thing that was very important to me was there is a table in the game that they're all sitting around that is made from a giant tree, and we found a giant tree table. So that is the set piece for the finger pointing scene at the heart of the film, which is too reminiscent of the game itself. You got to sit in a circle and smoke each other out, smoke out the werewolf.
Yeah. And the Beaverfield Inn, where a lot of the story takes place, which I thought it was interesting that that's an actual functioning inn the rest of the time,
Oh, yeah.
and that you just went there in the off season. But what I love about the way that you use that location and that space is that you take us into so many corners. And it's the same way that in Scare Me, you and Aya went into every single space and corner within that singular cabin. And so I'm very curious about the way in which you use space and blocking and choreography of scenes as a director.
First of all, the location has to be a character in and of itself. So you have to walk in and it has to feel right. So you do whatever you got to do to make sure that you get a space that feels conducive, not only to the production with the high ceilings and the light, but that also that it feels fun to look at, that it feels fun, that there are those sort of dark recessive corners, if that's relevant. For me, it's about emotional beats. It's about tableau directing. In this case, we mostly had one camera. So you've got to find those kind of Spielbergian tableaus where the cast can kind of work together to, make a scene play. But, the more you study each scene, the more you kind of shoot, or I shoot for my edit. And so a lot of it has to do with when I get into a space, I think, I kind of act out the movie in my head and feel the movie best I can. And sort of think, this space feels best for this emotional moment, and what won't distract from the storytelling. It will be better to shoot this werewolf mauling in the middle of the night in a dark labyrinthine hallway than it will in the open cafe or living room, because of the kind of the character of the space, and also leans into the kind of Agatha Christie mystery of it all.
And you brought up the emotional beats there. And one of the other ways in which you attack that is through the use of music in the film, whether it's Ace of Base and Savage Garden as a soundtrack item, or using music composition to build a certain tone at other points as well. And so what was the journey of mapping out what you wanted the two different spaces of music to be, and what you wanted to say through that?
I think I always knew there was a pretty buoyant kind of soundtrack lyrically. When thinking about werewolves, as I was kind of in the rewrite process and I was reading it, there were songs that would sort of pop up to me, and I would sort of make a Spotify playlist of it. I did the same, for Scare Me as well. So I would keep track of songs that might feel appropriate, when a lyrical song was appropriate. And my God, it was so fun to actually have a budget to be able to get the likes of Savage Garden and Ace of Base. But, Anna Drubich, who is our brilliant composer who just did, Fear Street and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark as two examples, we sort of found this kind of magical John Williams-esque kind of a mystical place, somewhere between Goonies and Poltergeist came this kind of whimsical. I wanted it to feel sort of, sweeping rather than modern and synthy. I wanted it to feel more like the films I watched growing up, and it really becomes transportive. And so I think the more kind of playful though dreadful moments of the orchestral can be, it plays well. It complements the the 90s of it all. I think ultimately because it feels like a movie sort of stuck in time in a way. There aren't cell phones really. There there aren't modern cars and stuff.
And character wise, it's so enjoyable with the fact that you get to take these characters and who they present themselves to be in the day to day. And then you get to put them in this circumstance and situation where they become slightly abhorrent versions of themselves as they start to blame everyone else. And when you were working with the cast on that aspect and really breaking down the veneer bit by bit with them,
Mhm.
was that something where you were figuring out some of those elements on set together, or did so much of that really come from the script?
A good amount came from the script, and you have to kind of feel what would be appropriate for, the kind of Agatha Christie-esque moments. Everybody needs their sort of eyebrow raise, I keep calling it. You feel that out, but again, you're working with the likes of, Michaela Watkins and Michael Chernus and Harvey Guillen and Sam. These guys have done the biggest comedy television shows and just TV television shows, and also you have, uh, Wayne Duvall's worked with Spielberg and the Coen brothers. Everybody knows pretty much what they're doing. They've all essentially done their homework, and then I'm basically playing second base coach. So where I felt like we needed to lean into a bit, I always made sure we had extra reactions where it was necessary without taking away too much time. The movie was a rush. I mean, we shot it in 23 days and change. So much of it is the prep and the kind of being the best barometer you can for the film and kind of playing it out in your head. What will be the most interesting? How can I throw people off the scent of, who the werewolf might be or who the killer might be, so to speak.
And there's so many fantastic scenes where you get to bring all of that cast together, which must be challenging in regards to, like you said, making this film very fast and having to get all of the coverage that you need of everybody. But the thing that you do so well in those moments is that you serve every single character and you continue evolving them and giving us more details, whether they're in the foreground or whether they're in the background of the scene. And so how did you figure out a lot of the blocking and a lot of the ways that you wanted to get that coverage that would do exactly that?
Well, you have to prioritize the storytelling. I think a really strong case is when Pete's mauled in the hallway upstairs. Not every actor is going to get a close up. That whole scene has pretty much has everything to do with Dr. Ellis and what Dr. Ellis. The whole scene is almost entirely from Dr. Ellis's perspective. So the blocking of that becomes about what's going to be the most interesting way to shift to that character, and having those conversations with actors who might be sort of questioning whether or not they're not all getting a close-up. That's a big conversation we're getting when we go into this process. Is we have one camera, this is a whodunit, not everybody's going to be in the background of every scene, but when you are, you're active. I do want to make it seem as if you guys might have a means or reason to be a suspect. So the blocking became quite economical for many reasons, but I think was a wonderful creative boundary, and everybody was just down to play and help each other too when they were sort of off camera reading with each other, like for the finger pointing scene and the like. Yeah.
Yeah. And directing this film and having a little bit more of a budget, but still having a lot of constraints, following directing Scare Me, how do you feel that your work on Scare Me really evolved you as a director and gave you a lot of tools specific to spaces that really enhance the work that you were able to do as a director on this project?
It reinforced, if anything, which is funny, thematically playing into the theme of Werewolves Within, like to be a good person, to shake people's hands, to go out of your way to know your crew, or as much of your crew as you can possibly cram in your scrambled eggs brain. But to be communicative too. I called every actor or met with every actor and asked them, how do you like to work? How do you like to be directed? And this is something that everyone from John Badham to Spielberg talk about, is you have to catalog, and Ron Howard especially, he did the whole masterclass, and this is you got to catalog psychologically who your actors are, what kind of people they are, what they like, what they prefer, they prefer to be talked to. The most wonderful thing about this cast is that they're the easiest to work with, the most ego free, which was spoiling to say the least. But but communication is everything, you know, and I treated everyone, and same thing with Scare Me. You know, you find out what works for Aya and Chris and Becky. Same thing on Werewolves. I wanted to treat these actors, especially at something at this level, and I'll continue to do the same, like I wanted to be treated as an actor by a director. I want to have my hand held a little bit, just in terms of being included in the process, so that I don't feel like I have to shield up and be, you know, an ass when we all do get on set, and I need to, you know, show them in my insecurity, show everybody that I know what I'm doing and I don't need to ask questions. And you know, I've seen that behavior, and I have felt that in myself. And so, you know, I think cluing everyone into what you're doing is a big piece of how to be successful.
Yeah. I absolutely loved the film, and as someone who gets scared far too easily by horror films because of the way that you play with genre and play with tone, I have to say you make some of my favorite horror movies. And thank you so much for sharing all of this, Josh.
Oh, Mara, thank you so much. That means a lot.